Hello, this is John talking about the Patriarchy. A couple of definitions. The first, given by feminists. Patriarchy is the term used to describe the society in which we live today, characterized by current and historic unequal power relations between women and men, whereby women are systematically disadvantaged and oppressed. And underneath here I've created my own definition. Patriarchy is the social expression of the instinct for male competition and is characterized by unequal power relations between men and men, whereby men are systematically disadvantaged and oppressed by systems of male hierarchy, and where women are sidelined to optimize their reproductive potential. So what does the bowels of the patriarchy look like? Well, nowadays it tends to consist of these four male-dominated institutions of violence and coercion. The government, which provides the motivation and it produces propaganda and threats. The courts, which produce a sort of false moral compass, and they also initiate propaganda and threats. The military, which of course serves the government and is an agency of enforcement through violence. And the police, which indirectly serve the government and the courts through enforcement using force. And of course sometimes violence as well, like the military. I've also got the church in there, which are not so influential nowadays, but they used to be very closely tied up with the government. In fact, governments arose probably through church institutions, and they also historically and still try to today provide a false moral compass, and they produce propaganda and threats. And these institutions are circled by the intelligentsia, the mass media, the educationists, and other agents of propaganda who essentially inform the population and initiate this cycle of misinformation that passes down from parents to children and then back again, of course. Okay, so we've had the definition and we've seen the specification of what the patriarchy actually is. Let's have a look at the biology that drives it. So we're a sexually dimorphic species. The males are larger than the females when you take account particularly of the higher amount of fat in the female body. There's quite a dimorphism. This indicates a polygynous heritage, and what that means is that men attempt to mate with as many females as they can or form a harem. And there's also a very high operational sex ratio. This means that there are many more reproductive males than there are sexually receptive females. So that's why I've depicted the female as the smaller icon here. They are lesser physically in size and lesser available for mating. So males have two rather different strategies for obtaining a mate. One is this sort of beta male, or the parental ally, who tries to form more lasting relationships with women and support their reproduction of the children. And there's also the more sort of alpha male, who is essentially a status seeker. And these status seeking males are attempting to promote or make themselves more visible to females by being higher up in some form of status hierarchy. And they do this by working on themselves in order to promote themselves, a sort of self-elevation by whatever means within their particular status hierarchy creates the higher status. But they also attempt to demote males in general around them, other males, through various means which we'll come on to in the next slide. And there's also men going their own way, or men on strike, who are men that have left essentially this patriarchal warfare and the consequences of it behind as much as they can, and are just kind of doing their own thing and not attempting to be part of the reproductive stock. So, how does the patriarchy actually work? Well, it engages in physical and emotional destruction of men. So if you think of things like circumcision, that would have had a high mortality or morbidity rate early on in the formation of patriarchal society. And circumcision isn't by any means the only kind of sort of deadly male rite around. There's other ways of sort of getting their young men to bump each other off. Nowadays, of course, we have high-risk labour, and this would have been a constant also throughout the history of mankind, hunting and so forth. And we have the more modern spectre of warfare, which is essentially the older dominant males spoiling the brains of young men, so that young men will go and exterminate each other and take themselves out of the gene pool. And then we also have this sort of functional destruction of men, which is things such as marriage, alimony and child support. These are legal mechanisms to basically incapacitate men who have already been selected for breeding, and ways of trying to inhibit them from further successful reproduction. We also have an entire edifice of sort of emotional destruction by creating a self-effacing male gender role. Men don't cry, men shouldn't whine, men shouldn't concern themselves about their physical well-being, and we see the results of that with alcoholism and so forth. And then we have sort of flat-out criminalisation and the disproportionate number of men that end up in prison. For example, if you think of black males in the USA and the very high rates of incarceration for selling the wrong kind of herbs and trading in the wrong kinds of chemicals for their own private gain. So let's just look at some of the effects of the patriarchal male competition. Almost a century now since World War One. The military, of course, at that time was very much male dominated, so the 9.7 million military dead would have been mostly men, as would have the 21 million military who were wounded. Again, they would have been mostly men. Almost 1 million civilians died from the direct effects of the war, and about 6 million civilians from the after effects, the devastation of the warfare. So it was a bit of a male holocaust. And what about privilege? Well, of course, male on male competition is all about obtaining the privilege of more reproductive opportunities, and of course it's all about wealth and power as well, and that's what they bring, more reproductive opportunities. But at the same time, there's a cost to be paid for this struggle, and men versus women have much higher incidences of mortality, morbidity, suicide, criminalisation, accidents, childhood emotional disorders, and alcoholism and drug addiction. So there's a price to be paid for this power game. So finally, I'd like to invite men to detach and disassociate from these systems of male destruction. If you've enjoyed my program, please do subscribe to the channel, and I wish you very well.